Steve Edwards is an expert in education programs and youth violence prevention. He's also a former vice president at the National Crime Prevention Council. Now, Steve, you've encountered what occurred at Penn State as a consultant to education programs. When you heard about the story, what was your first reaction, and what did your gut tell you about what went wrong?
Well, yes, David, I've heard about, I've dealt with situations like this in my role with the National Crime Prevention Council, but also in my role as an educator and as a consultant. And my immediate reaction was attempt to cover things up that had taken place, it sounds like, several years ago. And my immediate reaction also included that people were attempting, of course, to cover their tracks.
You know, right when we first heard about this news, we started hearing some kind of hedge Joe Paterno's actions by saying, well, you know what, legally, he didn't actually have to report it to the police. He just had to report it to the person above him. And then it's not really his responsibility if they don't go to the police. But it seems if we step back for a second and look at this more broadly, there seems to be this kind of culture that nobody wants to be the one to take down the football program. And that regardless of the law, that's really what was at the root of it. Nobody wanted to be the person who said, you brought down Penn State football. Is there really any way to prevent that?
Well, you know, these situations occur not only at places like Penn State, but in schools across the country and in different organizations. And from my perspective, there's two sides to this, or two key points. One is that there's a legal perspective. I may have followed the policy by reporting to my supervisor an incident that occurred that I believe was inappropriate, violated potentially legal violations. But beyond that, there's also a moral and ethical perspective. And if I followed the, quote, rules and reported something to my supervisor, for me, that doesn't let me off the hook. If my supervisors do not act on it or do not act in a way that I feel is appropriate, then I have a moral and ethical obligation to then take that to the next level. I always put, the question I always ask people, would it be okay if it was your child, your grandchild? How would you respond? Would it be okay if they just reported it to their supervisor and it ended there? If it was your child? I think not. I think we'd expect that things would be dealt with in a much different way.
Do you think that the reaction that we saw from the students was an uninformed reaction that had and I'm talking about the rioting and the flipping over of a van and saying we want Joe Paterno back? Was the reaction an uninformed one, or in my opinion worse, was it informed and they still thought that the right thing was for Joe Paterno to stick around and to come to the defense, in some cases even a couple of signs defending Jerry Sandusky? You've worked with, you know, with students at all levels. What's your reaction to that? That doesn't sound to me like college kids.
Well, sometimes I think we're also in that age range looking for a reason to have a, quote, riot. Somebody wins a Super Bowl, the city has a riot. They flip over cars, they light fires, they riot in the streets. So sometimes I think it's just a reason to let loose. I guess, you know, I would argue that it is an ill-informed audience, and people hear what they want to hear. We filter things based on our own paradigm, and we place celebrities, coaches, actors, actresses, people in our society, athletes, on a very high pedestal. And often we'll see in situations like this that they're held to a different standard, and not the same standard that, quote, the average man or woman is held to. So I think it's a combination of things. One, I think it's a fact that we're looking for a reason many times on college campuses or in communities to have a riot, so to speak. Also that we're often ill-informed. And thirdly, that we sometimes want to protect people in positions like this and not hold them, again, to the same standards that we hold the average Joe and Jane in the community.
If we go beyond what happened, who reported it, et cetera, to the question of how can you, at the institutional level, have a system that doesn't make it as easy for this type of abuse to happen to this number of people, alleged, of course, at this point, over this period of time? I mean, how can you set up an infrastructure that would make that more difficult?
Well, one of the keys is to constantly have conversations about topics like this and what the expectation is for response to situations like this. I know in my experiences in public education, the opening of the school year would always be a series of policy issues that would cover topics such as this. And often people pay little attention to those. You've got to continue to keep these conversations as a front burner item. And people need to understand that there's not only a legal, moral, and ethical responsibility to follow through on these. I think too many times they're just read as a policy, or refer to your policy handbook or your policy statutes or whatever, where these have to be spelled out, identifying specific cases that have taken place, and the responsibility that goes along with being in a position such as teacher, coach, university president, and so on.
Well, we're going to keep watching it. And, I think that in some of these cases, maybe it should be a policy that educational institutions take upon themselves, that they're going to go, regardless of what the state law is, and say, you have a responsibility that you must report this. You forget it. Your job is at stake if you don't report this. Even if Pennsylvania, for example, only says you have to report this to your supervisor, what if the school said you need to take the maximum action? What the state requires is not enough for us to be part of this educational institution. Would that be a good idea, or are there problems inherent in that?
Well, I think it's always good to have high expectations and take the higher ground with respect to any institution, that we're going to go above and beyond what maybe the state or federal law requires. But for me, it's continually personalizing this and making it something that is more relevant to people. People look at statutes and it becomes very impersonal. When you make it personal, it's different. And the other situation we find ourselves in is constantly being in this reactive mode instead of being proactive. How might an institution like Penn State have been viewed differently if they had addressed this right from the beginning?
Absolutely. That's a question we're going to continue asking. Steve Edwards, expert in education programs, youth violence prevention, and former VP at the National Crime Prevention Council. Great to talk to you on this, Steve, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, David. Good to talk to you.